Let's talk about an RDL motion. So many times when people RDL, this is what I see, is this big posterior weight shift. And notice how when I do that, my toes almost lift off because I come into so much plantar flexion at my ankle. I should own my feet the entire time. The more I can own my feet and press my feet into the ground, the better my pelvis will sort of float up above my femur heads and then be able to move into flexion. There is still a relative posterior shift when I bend forward, but it's not so much that I lose the connection to my feet. When I keep the weight shift more even, less posterior, and get the lift, then the other thing that happens is I reflexively click on in my core and it protects my back a lot more. If I focus on pushing my butt back, it actually creates a lot of tension in the peripheral nerves of the back of my leg, as well as puts really big fulcrum on my low back. And completely destabilizes me because now I don't have that reflexive connection in my core. Part of the reflexive connection into your core is that your body is preventing you from falling over forward. So it should feel like you're so much forward that everything's clicking on to allow you to not lose your balance, right? But you'll notice that even as I keep that relatively forward, my weight still shifts back. So it's just not the first thing that happens. So when you see people hip hinging or doing an RDL pattern, look at their ankles. If their ankles move into plantar flexion, you know they're going too far back. And let's look at it with weight. So here is keeping connected to my feet. Here is a big posterior weight shift. Which looks better to you? So I'll be sharing the results of the poll soon. And I already posted the answers, my opinion on RDLs patterning. The responses are also interesting to read. I love reading them and seeing what you guys see and what your thoughts are. But I also want to talk about the fact that if we put our weight on our heels, it's not necessarily a bad thing, but it creates a different spine mechanic and it becomes more of a pulling motion. Now, technically, RDLs would be categorized as a pull, which they are, but if you're going to do a true pull, that's going to be more of a deadlift style with a C-curve or flexed spine. The reason I'm sharing this is because not all pulls are equal. Not all exercises are equal. And understanding the subtle differences allows you to know when to use the correct cues. And sitting your hips back is not necessarily a bad cue, or even having a more of a deadlift style is not a bad way to lift and pull weight from the ground. But if you're so posteriorly weight shifted that you lose connection to the fronts of your feet, that would not be good in any of these scenarios. Personally, I find that true deadlifting is extremely hard to coach because it's hard for people to understand that connection into a lifted C-curve and still have a connection from their feet to the pelvis. So RDLs become a easier way to coach to still get the benefits of posterior chain without the loading on the spine. And if that truly is why you're using an RDL, that's why it's so important to keep the weight more forward and limit the amount of posterior weight shift so you keep the trunk very supported in the fascial tensegrity connection of the feet to the core, right? Because if you shift your weight back too far in an RDL, you're going to have adverse neural tension and adverse loading of a spine position that's neutral, which is not as strong in accepting load as a flexed spine. What I really love about it is in both of these scenarios, an RDL and a deadlift, you have to be really active with your feet in order to keep that core connected, whether it's in neutral or flexed, to have the best situation possible for strength, stability, and pull. What happens too when we go back on our heels, a lot of times when our weight goes to our heels, our butt actually tucks in response, which is why a traditional deadlift from a pulling standpoint, when our weight's more on our heels and our legs are turned out, is actually okay to have a curve in your back. So I've really opened a can of worms in my brain, but just because of all that, when I'm programming a deadlift, like a hex bar, trap bar deadlift, because we cue it with a flat back, I actually program it as a push, not a pull. I know, crazy, right? I know we're still pulling the weight from the ground, but it's with a pushing motion in our legs. So to me, it's a lower body push. And also, if you can't tell, I love semantics. Like, love them. Like, thinking about why we name things, what the definitions are for things, and are we really using them correctly? Are we saying what we think we're saying? It's sort of in the same category as cues. Are people using our cues and doing what we think they should be doing with them? Or are you just giving generic cues for the exercise? Are you cueing the person that's in front of you or the exercise? We need to do it for the person in front of us. So realize when your cues are actually destabilizing people and not promoting good patterns in their body. One last thing, I love the comment about asking me how it felt. That matters, and actually, if this was an athlete I was working with, before I corrected them, I probably would have asked, how does that feel? Where do you feel that? And on video number 2, where I felt that is a lot of tension, which I know my body enough to know it's nerve tension in the backs of my legs. And I felt it was a little bit more pressure in my back, and it was a little harder. Video 1 to me felt I was very aware of the connection into my core, and then I felt it like actually working my hamstrings and my butt a lot more. Now, if this, again, going to how I would do it with my athletes, I would have asked them, like if they were video number 2 first, which I don't like, I would have said, how does it feel? Where do you feel it? And however they answered was not wrong. I would just be like, oh, interesting. Then I would have them try the new version. And I'd ask them, how does that feel? Where do you feel it? And then probably 9 out of 10 times, they're like, whoa, I felt that more in my hamstrings and my butt, and I didn't feel in my back at all. Whether or not they realized they were feeling it in their back a lot in the first variation. And so then I asked them, which one do you think would be better for us to work on? And they're like, the second one. Yeah. And that is also how I get them to start to realize that they can trust their own body, and how they feel matters the most because their body knows what's best. So even if they answered and disagreed with me and they thought their original one felt the best in their body, that's the one we go with, not the one that I think best. I am offering cues as suggestions to perhaps create a movement experience that feels better in their body. Not to my eye all the time, not to my liking all the time, but what feels best for them.